Douglas Ashworth died at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in October. The accident report said the logging truck had crossed the center line on Interstate 80. The truck driver survived. Douglas did not. He had been 62 miles from home, returning from what his calendar described as a consulting trip, the last of what had been throughout their 35 years of marriage, a long series of consulting trips that took him away for days at a time and brought him back quieter than he had left. Marlene had identified him at the county hospital at 1 a.m. She had driven herself. She had stood in the corridor for a long time after looking at the wall, and then she had driven home and sat at the kitchen table until the sun came up. 3 days later, Chester arrived. He came with Darlene and a folder and the specific composure of a man who had been preparing for this moment and was executing the preparation. He sat down in the living room, Douglas's living room, the room with the fireplace Douglas had built the second winter they lived here, and he placed the folder on the coffee table, and he explained with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed the explanation that Douglas had died without a will. He said the property is held in the family trust. Under the terms of the trust, it reverts to the Ashworth family bloodline. That means me. He said, I know this is hard timing. Marlene looked at the folder. She said, How long do I have? Chester said, We'd like to move forward quickly, for everyone's sake. 1 week later, she was in the garage. Chester had offered her the garage as a temporary accommodation with the specific warmth of a man performing generosity at a discount. She had accepted because she had nowhere else to go, and because she needed time to think. And the garage with its workbench and its smell of oil and old wood was the room in the property most thoroughly saturated with Douglas's presence, and she was not ready to leave that. She was packing the last of his tools when she found it. Under the floor mat of his truck, the old one, the one he had driven on the long trips, the one with the cracked dashboard and the coffee holder that had never worked correctly, was a metal box, the kind you bought at a hardware store, latched but not locked. She opened it. Receipts, hundreds of them. Gas stations and motels and hardware stores and a lumber yard, all of them from the past 25 years, all of them clustered around a geography she did not recognize, a town called Millbrook in the northern part of the state. Receipts from Millbrook, receipts from the county around it, receipts from the roads between here and there. And beneath the receipts, a document, a deed. She read the property description. She read the address and address in Millbrook she had never heard of. She read the date of recording. She read the name in the ownership line. Marlene Ruth Ashworth. She sat in Douglas's truck for a long time. She thought about 35 years of consulting trips. She thought about what she had assumed and what she had not asked. She thought about the gap between those two things, which was apparently 400 miles wide and 25 years deep. The next morning she filled the tank. She drove north, the road to Millbrook. The call came at 12:19 in the morning. Marlene had been awake. She had been awake for the specific reason that Douglas was not home, yet he had called at 9 to say he was 2 hours out. The consulting visit had run long. He would be back by 11. She had said, Be careful on 80. The weather report said possible fog. He had said, I'll be careful. He had said it the way he said most things, simply without elaboration, as a statement of fact. At 12:19, the phone rang, and it was the county sheriff's dispatcher, and by 12:45, she was in the car. She drove the 62 miles to the hospital in the specific focused silence of a person who has not yet allowed themselves to know what they already know. She found the corridor. She spoke to the doctor. She stood at the window of the room they had not cleaned up yet, and she looked at Douglas, at the face she had been looking at for 35 years, which was recognizably his face, and was also something else, was something that had already begun the long process of becoming simply what remained. And she stood there until a nurse gently asked if she needed anything. She said no. She drove home. She sat at the kitchen table. She watched the sun come up through the east window, the same window she had watched it come up through for 35 years of mornings, and she thought, well, there it is. The funeral was on a Thursday. 112 people, which had surprised Marlene in the specific way that her husband's existence always surprised her when it was made visible outside the boundaries of their shared life. Douglas had been a man who moved through the world without announcement, who did his work and came home and said little about either, and she had come to understand this as the character of a private man. The 112 people in the funeral home reminded her that private was not the same as solitary, that Douglas had occupied a larger space in the world than he had ever described to her. Chester spoke. He stood at the podium in his good suit, and he spoke about Douglas with the specific warmth of a man demonstrating grief for an audience. And Marlene sat in the front row and listened, and heard beneath the warmth the particular frequency of a man who had been waiting for something and was managing the wait. She had known Chester for 35 years. She had never trusted him. She had told Douglas this once early in the marriage, and Douglas had been quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something was complicated, and then he had said, "Chester is who he is. The best thing to do is know that." She had not fully understood what he meant. She was beginning to understand. Chester came to the house the following day with Darlene and the folder. Marlene had been in the kitchen when the car pulled up. She had seen it from the window, the silver SUV that Chester drove when he wanted to communicate success, and she had set down her coffee cup and stood with her hands at her sides and waited. Chester explained the situation with the practiced brevity of a man covering familiar material. The Ashworth property, the house, the adjacent land, the equipment in the shop, had been held in a family trust established by Douglas and Chester's father in 1978. The trust was structured for bloodline inheritance. Douglas had died without a will that superseded the trust's terms. Under those terms, the property passed to the surviving male line, which was Chester. He said, "I know this is difficult timing." Marlene looked at him. "She said you came the day after the funeral." Chester said these things are better addressed quickly, for everyone. Darlene, sitting beside him, said nothing. She had the expression of a woman who had identified the outcome she wanted and was monitoring the path to it. Marlene said, "I've lived in this house for 35 years. Chester said, "I understand that. We want to be fair. You can have 30 days. The garage is separate from the main structure. You can use it while you make arrangements." He said the bedroom is going to need to be... He produced a key from his pocket. He stood up. He crossed the room. He locked the door to the main hallway, the door that connected the kitchen to the rest of the house, the door Marlene had walked through 10,000 times, with the specific, deliberate motion of a man making a point with an action, because the point with words had already been made. He pocketed the key. He said, 30 days, Marlene." She looked at the locked door. She thought about 35 years of mornings walking through that door, Douglas reading at the kitchen table before she came down, the particular creak of the third step that they had both learned to step around and had never gotten around to fixing. She said, "Then I should start in the garage." Chester said, "Whatever you need." He and Darlene left. Marlene stood in the kitchen. She looked at the locked door. She looked at the east window. She thought, "Douglas, what did you know that you didn't tell me?" It was not the first time she had asked this question. She had been asking it in one form or another for 35 years. She had simply never known how specific the answer was going to be. The garage held Douglas's life in the specific way that garages held the lives of men who worked with their hands, the tools on the pegboard in the order he had arranged them, the workbench with the stain from the project he had never finished, the shelves of materials that had accumulated through decades of intentions. She moved through it with the methodical attention of a librarian, which she had been for 31 years, and still was in the habits of her thinking. Everything had a place. Everything in its place told you something about the person who had placed it. The truck was at the back. The old one, not the newer one that Chester had already claimed, but the one Douglas had driven on the long trips, the one that was old enough to have been purchased before she had learned not to ask about the long trips. She opened the driver's door. She sat in it. She ran her hands over the cracked dashboard, the coffee holder that had never worked the gear shift, that had a specific resistance she remembered from the one time she had driven it. She lifted the floor mat. The box was there. She opened it. She read for a long time. The light in the garage changed. While she read, went from the flat gray of morning to the specific slant of afternoon coming through the high window, and she did not notice the change because she was reading the way she had always read, with her full attention, following the evidence where it led. When she finished, she sat for a while. She thought 400 miles. She thought 25 years. She thought about Douglas on the road, all those roads, all those years, and about what she had imagined him doing on them, and what apparently he had actually been doing. She put the box on the passenger seat. She said to the cab of the truck, to the cracked dashboard, to the coffee holder that had never worked, "What did you build, Douglas?" The garage was quiet. She got out of the truck. She went to find a road atlas. She found the loose board on the second day. The first day in the garage she had spent simply being in it, sitting at Douglas's workbench, handling his tools, reading the accumulated evidence of a man's practical life. She was not ready on the first day to do anything as purposeful as searching. She was simply present in the space he had occupied, the way you sat in a chair that still held warmth from the person who had just left it. The second day she worked. She had been a librarian for 31 years. She understood systems. She understood that the way things were organized told you something about the mind that had organized them. That arrangement was a form of communication, that every choice about where to put something was a small, legible decision about what mattered and what belonged together. Douglas's garage was organized with the specific logic of a man who knew where everything was and expected to be the only one who needed to. The tools on the pegboard were arranged by function rather than size, which was not the way a casual organizer would arrange them, but was the way someone who used the tools regularly would arrange them, so that the next step in a process was always adjacent to the current one. She moved through it methodically. She cataloged what was there. Not literally, she was not making a list, but in the library sense, which was building a mental map of the contents, so that anything missing or out of place would be visible. The old sedan was at the back. Douglas had kept it long past its usefulness, which was unusual for him. He was not a sentimental man about objects. He replaced things when they stopped working without ceremony, without the specific attachment that some people develop to their possessions. She had teased him about this once. She herself tended to keep things, and he had said an object is only useful while it works. When it stops working, you replace it. The sedan had stopped working. He had kept it anyway. She crouched beside it to look at the underside, checking the condition of the floor, not for any specific reason, the methodical habit of a person completing a survey. The board was slightly proud of the surface. Just slightly. A millimeter, perhaps 2. Enough that her eye caught it. She pressed it. It gave. The box was under the board in a space that had been excavated, not deeply, 6 inches perhaps, but deliberately the space of something that had been planned and built, and not arrived at accidentally. The box was Metal Standard Hardware Store, the kind that came with a lock and a small key. The lock was engaged. She looked at the box for a moment. She thought, so there is something here. She had not been certain until this moment that there was something here. She had been moving through the garage with the open attention of a librarian surveying a collection, not looking for anything specific available to whatever was there. Now there was something specific. She went to find the key. She had packed Douglas's personal effects from the hospital in a Ziploc bag that was in the cardboard box she had been sleeping beside in the garage. His wallet, his watch, his phone, and the keys from his pocket. She found the keys. There were 4 of them on the ring, the truck key, the house key, the shop key, and one she had not identified. Small, flat, the kind that came with a hardware store lockbox. She went back to the box. The key turned. The receipts were organized by date. She understood this immediately. She was a librarian. She recognized organization, and the recognition told her something about Douglas before she had read a single receipt. He had kept these. He had kept them deliberately in order in a locked box under a hidden floorboard. Whatever these receipts documented, he had considered the documentation important. She spread them on the workbench. The earliest was from 25 years ago, a gas station in a town called Heller Creek, which she did not recognize. She checked the date, late September, a year she remembered as an ordinary year, the year they had repainted the front of the house, the year her sister had visited from Ohio, an unremarkable year in their shared life. The receipts continued. Gas stations and motels and diners, all of them in a geography she was assembling, as she read a corridor of towns running north, approximately 400 miles, the route that would take you from here to a place called Millbrook. She searched her memory for Millbrook. Nothing! She had never heard Douglas mention it. In 35 years of conversations and 35 years of his returns from the long trips, she had never heard that name. She kept reading. The receipts accumulated hardware stores, lumber yards, a plumbing supply, an electrical supply, not just passing through, working. Whatever Douglas had been doing in the direction of Millbrook, he had been doing it with materials. She was building a picture. The picture was not the picture she had expected. She had half expected she could admit this to herself in the specific privacy of a locked garage with no one to perform her reactions for, that the picture would be what wives feared when their husbands took unexplained trips, another life, another person. The specific betrayal that was also the most legible betrayal, the one that had a name and a shape. This was not that picture. Hardware stores did not fit that picture. Lumberyards did not fit that picture. A plumbing supply and an electrical supply and 25 years of organized receipts kept in a locked box under a hidden board in a garage that a man who did not keep things had kept. This was a different picture. She had not yet identified the subject of it. The deed was at the bottom of the box. Not the original, a photocopy, clean the copying machine's rendering of a document that had originally been on a heavy legal paper. She could see the quality of the paper even through the copy. She read it. Property description. An address in Millbrook that she could not visualize because she had never been to Millbrook. Legal description of the parcel acreage boundaries coordinates. Date of recording 11 years ago. Name of the county, not her county, the county 400 miles north. And in the ownership line in the flat font of a legal document that did not know the weight of what it was saying. Marlene Ruth Ashworth. She read it twice. She looked at the photocopy of the deed, at the specific legal language, at the date, at the county seal, at the name that was hers. She sat down on the garage floor. Her back was against the side of the old sedan. She held the deed in both hands. She thought about Douglas on the road, all those roads 400 miles, 25 years. She thought about the hardware store receipts and the lumberyard receipts and the plumbing supply and the electrical supply. She thought about a man who did not keep things, keeping these receipts locked, hidden, organized by date. She thought you were building something. She thought, and you put it in my name. She sat on the garage floor and held the deed and looked at the high window where the afternoon light was coming in at the angle it came in at this time of day. And she felt not grief exactly, not the acute grief of the past week, but something quieter and more disorienting, the specific vertigo of a person who has understood that the map they have been using does not match the territory. Douglas had been somewhere for 25 years that she had not known about. He had been building something. He had put it in her name. She needed to go to Millbrook. She sat for a moment longer. Then she picked up the keys. She left at 6 a.m. The road atlas was on the passenger seat, open to the page that showed the northern part of the state. She had traced the route with a pencil the night before, following the corridor of towns that appeared on the receipts, building the geography of Douglas's 25 years of travel into something she could see. It was 412 miles according to the atlas, 6 hours roughly depending on stops. She had the metal box on the passenger seat beside the atlas. She had not slept much. The first hour was familiar road, the stretch of highway she had driven for errands and appointments and the ordinary business of a life in this part of the state. She passed the hospital where Douglas had been pronounced dead. She did not look at it directly. She kept her eyes on the road. The second hour took her into country she knew less well, the transitional territory between the populated corridors and the open land. The farmhouses spaced farther apart, the gas stations fewer. The morning light was doing what it did in October, coming in flat and specific, the light of a season that had stopped pretending to be summer and was being honestly itself. She drove the way she did most things, steadily, without hurrying, with her attention on what was in front of her. She thought about Douglas. She had married him in 1988 when she was 33 and he was 35, and they had both arrived at marriage late enough to have stopped requiring it to be anything other than what it was. He was not romantic in the conventional sense, did not bring flowers or write cards or say the things that people said in the movies she occasionally watched. What he did was show up. He was reliable in the specific, unglamorous way of a load-bearing wall, not visible, not celebrated, but present. And without him, the structure would not hold. She had loved him for that. She had also spent 35 years married to a man she sometimes felt she did not entirely know. Not in the dramatic sense, she had never suspected another woman not seriously, not with evidence. But in the smaller sense, there were rooms in Douglas's interior that she had never been invited into, and she had made peace with, that had told herself it was the character of a private man had filed it under the heading of what she knew about him, and stopped asking what she didn't. Now she was driving 400 miles toward the contents of those rooms. She was not certain she was ready. She drove anyway. The gas station appeared at mile 207. She recognized it from a receipt. The name on the receipt had been Miller's Service, and the sign above the pump said, Miller's Service, and the building had the specific weathered quality of a place that had been doing the same thing in the same location for decades and had stopped worrying about appearances sometime in the 90s. She pulled in, not because she needed gas, she had filled the tank before she left. She pulled in because the receipt in the box was dated 2 months before Douglas died, which meant he had been here recently, which meant someone here might remember him. The man who came out to meet her was in his 70s, wearing a canvas jacket and an expression of professional welcome that softened into something more genuine when she got out of the car. She said, "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm looking for information about someone who used to stop here. My husband." She took out her phone. She had a photograph of Douglas from 2 summers ago. She had taken it in the backyard. He had been standing at the grill and had turned when she called his name, and she had taken the picture before he could arrange his face into the expression he used for photographs. It was the most like him she had ever managed to capture. She showed it to the man. He looked at it. His expression changed. He said, "Oh, that's Mr. Ashworth. Sure, I know him. He's been coming through here how long? 20 years, maybe more. Every few weeks in the summer, less in winter. Always gets the same thing, fill up large coffee, no sugar." He said, "Is he all right?" Marlene said he died last month. An accident on 80. The man removed his cap. He held it in both hands. He said, "I'm sorry to hear that. He was a good man, quiet. But he always had a word." Marlene said, "Did he ever tell you what brought him this way? What he was doing up north?" The man put his cap back on. He said building a house. He mentioned it not the first few years, but after a while, when we got to talking regular. He said he was building a place up near Millbrook, taking his time with it, doing most of the work himself on weekends when he could manage it. He said it was for his wife. Marlene looked at him. She said he said that. The man said Saidi wanted her to have a place that was just hers. No complicated family situation, no, I don't know the specifics, he didn't go into it. But he said he wanted her to have somewhere that was just hers. He seemed like a man with a plan. He said he told me last time he was through must have been September. He said it was nearly finished. Said he was going to bring her up in the spring, show her what he'd been working on. He looked at Marlene. He looked at the car. He made the calculation that a man in his 70s made when a woman in her late 60s drove alone into his gas station with grief in her eyes and a photograph of a dead man on her phone. He said, "You're her. You're the wife." Marlene said yes. He said he talked about you. Not a lot, he wasn't that kind of man. But enough. He said you were the kind of person who deserved to have something that was just yours. Marlene looked at the road going north. The man said spring was going to be soon. She said yes. She said, "I know." She paid for a coffee. She didn't need large no sugar the way Douglas had ordered it as a form of something she could not name, and she got back in the car. And she sat for a moment with the engine running and the coffee in the holder and the metal box on the passenger seat and the atlas open to the page with her pencil line running north. Douglas had been building something. He had been building it for 25 years. He had been going to show her in the spring. She put the car in drive. She went north. The landscape changed as she drove. Not dramatically, the Midwest did not do dramatic mostly, but in the way that 400 miles of latitude changed a landscape, the trees denser, the hills more present, the quality of the air different in a way she noticed without being able to name. She passed through the towns on the receipts: Heller Creek, where the first receipt had been dated 25 years ago, Vandenberg, where there was a hardware store receipt from 14 years ago, Crestfield, where there was a lumber yard. At Vandenberg, she stopped at the hardware store. The woman at the register did not remember Douglas. The store had changed hands twice since the date on the receipt, but she found in the back of the store the specific section for timber joinery hardware, and she looked at the bolts and the brackets and the specific materials of a man building something in wood, and she thought he knew what he was doing. Douglas had been a structural engineer for 40 years. He had built bridges. He had known in the precise technical sense how things were put together so that they held. She got back in the car. She was 2 hours from Millbrook. She thought about spring. She thought about Douglas's plan, the specific shape of it, the patience of it, 25 years of every few weeks lumber and hardware, and a man who built things that held. She thought about what it meant to build something in secret for 25 years and then plan to reveal it in the spring. She thought he was going to show me. He had been going to take her north on a spring morning and show her what he had made. And then the truck had crossed the center line on Interstate 80. She drove. The afternoon light came in flat and honest through the windshield. Outside Crestfield, a field of harvested corn ran to the tree line, the stalks cut low. The land open and quiet, in the specific way of worked land at the end of the season. Douglas had driven past this field many times. On his way to build her something. She kept her eyes on the road. She drove north. Millbrook appeared without announcement. That was the thing about small towns in this part of the country. They didn't build toward themselves the way cities did with the escalating infrastructure of approach, the increasing density that told you something significant was coming. Millbrook simply appeared: a water tower, a grain elevator, a stoplight that was the first stoplight she had seen in 40 miles, and then Main Street, 2 blocks of it, the specific compressed Main Street of a town that had been built to serve the people around it and had not tried to be anything more. She drove slowly. The town square was what the name promised: an actual square with a small park at its center and benches and an oak tree that had been there long enough to have developed opinions. A bakery on the north side, a post office on the east, a hardware store, she noted this, filed it, on the west. And on the south side, between a barber shop and what appeared to be an insurance office, a narrow building with a wooden sign above the door: Cormack and Son Attorneys at Law. The deed had been notarized by a Silas Cormack, Notary Public, Millbrook. She parked. The front room of the office had the quality of a space that had been a working law office for decades and was now something slightly different. The furniture still arranged for professional purposes, the bookshelves still full of legal volumes, but the dust on some surfaces and the quality of the light suggesting a place that was occupied rather than operational, a place that someone still came to, but not every day. A bell above the door had rung when she entered. She stood at the front desk and waited. She heard from the back room the specific sounds of an older person making their way toward a sound, the careful, deliberate movement, the pause, the resumption. Then the door behind the desk opened and a man came through it. He was 78. She estimated lean and upright, in the way of men who had been physically active their whole lives and had carried the habit of it into old age. White hair, neat, eyes that were doing something she recognized. They were assessing her, with the specific focused attention of someone who already knew who she was and was confirming the identification. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Mrs. Ashworth." Not a question. She said, "You were expecting me." He said, "Not today specifically." "But yes, Douglas told me you'd come eventually." He said, "If I go before I can show her myself, she'll find the box. She'll read the receipts. She'll follow them." He said, "Give her time, but she'll come." He came around the desk and extended his hand. He said, "Silas Cormack. I've been Douglas's attorney in this county for 23 years. Please sit down. I expect you've had a long drive." She sat in the chair across from his desk, an old chair leather, the kind that had held many people with many problems, and she set the metal box on the desk between them and looked at Silas Cormack, who had known her husband for 23 years, in a town she had never heard of. She said, "Tell me." He said, "From the beginning." She said, "From wherever it makes sense to start." He settled back. He said Douglas came to Millbrook for the first time 25 years ago. He came to look at land. He had a specific thing in mind. He knew what he wanted. He just needed to find the right piece. He found it about 3 miles from here on the north side of town. 40 acres, mostly wooded, with a clearing on the east side that got the morning light. He bought it for cash. He said he came to me to handle the deed. I was still in active practice then. He told me he wanted the property recorded in his wife's name, only not jointly, not in trust, solely in her name. I asked him why. He said, "Because my family has a way of taking what they consider theirs, and I want to make sure this is beyond their reach." He said he was very clear about that. "Beyond their reach," he said. Those were his words. Marlene said Chester. Silas said he didn't name anyone specifically, but from things he said over the years I understood the situation well enough. She said he bought the land 25 years ago. What was he doing there for 25 years? Silas said building. He said it simply with the simplicity of something that had a simple answer. He said he started with the foundation the first summer. He was a structural engineer, you know that. He knew how to read soil, how to pour concrete, how to build something that would last. He came up as often as he could manage, weekends mostly, sometimes, a few days during the week when work allowed. In the early years when he was still employed full-time, it was once a month. After he retired, more often. He said he did most of it himself, hired local help for the heavy work, the framing the roof, but he did the finishing work himself. Flooring, cabinetry, the masonry on the fireplace. He said he wanted to be able to tell you he'd built it with his own hands. He said I used to see him in town on Saturday mornings having breakfast at the diner before he went out to the property. We got to talking over the years. He told me about you, about your work at the library, about your garden, about the way you organized the spice cabinet alphabetically, which he found his word endearing. Marlene looked at the desk. She thought about the spice cabinet. She had organized it alphabetically for 30 years, and Douglas had occasionally rearranged things while cooking. And she had rearranged them back without comment, and this had been one of the small, ongoing negotiations of their shared life, so minor she had not thought of it as a thing that would be recounted to a stranger in a small town 400 miles away. She said he talked about me, Silas said. Often. He was not an effusive man. I expect you know that better than anyone. But when he talked about you, there was a quality to it. He was proud of you. He thought you were... He used the word sturdy, which, coming from Douglas, I understood as a significant compliment. He said she's the most capable person I know, and she doesn't know it, and I've been trying to figure out how to show her for 30 years. He said the house was part of the answer. Marlene was quiet. Outside the window, Millbrook was doing what small towns did in the late afternoon, settling into itself, the light going warmer, the specific pace of a place that was not in a hurry and had never intended to be. Silas reached into the top drawer of his desk. He produced a key, old, the kind of key that belonged to a wooden door with a lock that had been installed before deadbolts became standard heavy, with the simple, specific shape of a key for a house. He set it on the desk between them. He said it's about 3 miles north. I can take you or I can draw you a map, but I thought you might want to drive out yourself. He said it's been waiting for you. 25 years, give or take. He said, "Would you like to see your house, Mrs. Ashworth?" Marlene looked at the key. She thought about Douglas on the road. All those roads, this road, 400 miles every few weeks for 25 years. She thought about the hardware store receipts and the lumberyard receipts and the man at the gas station who had known his order. Large coffee, no sugar. She thought about a man who built bridges telling a stranger in a small town that his wife was the most capable person he knew and didn't know it. She reached across the desk. She picked up the key. Silas drove. He had offered to draw her a map, and she had accepted the offer of the drive instead because she understood in the way she had come to understand many things on this trip that there were some arrivals that required a witness. She followed his car and hers, a slow procession of 2 vehicles on a county road that left the town square behind, and moved north through the specific landscape of the rural Midwest in October fields, in their post-harvest quiet woodlots with their leaves mostly down the occasional farmstead set back from the road with the particular self-contained look of places that had been managing their own affairs for a long time. 3 miles. She had been driving 400 miles and now it was 3 more. The turn was onto a gravel road that she would not have found without Silas. It was not marked, just a gap in the tree line where the gravel began and the trees closed back around it almost immediately. She followed his taillights through the canopy. The oaks on either side of the road were old enough to have developed the specific character of trees that had been growing in one place long enough to become architectural, their branches meeting overhead in the way of things that had been growing toward each other for decades without knowing that was what they were doing. Douglas had driven this road. She drove it now. The road curved left, and then the trees opened, and the house was there. She stopped the car. She sat for a moment. The house was small, smaller than she had expected, though she had not known what to expect, and smaller was not wrong. It was a single-story, wood-framed, with a covered porch along the front and a stone chimney at the east end and windows placed with the specific attention of someone who had thought carefully about where the light would come from and when. The wood was weathered silver gray in the way of wood that had been properly treated and left to find its own color over years. The porch had a swing. She looked at the swing for a moment, the simple wooden bench on chains, the kind that had been on porches in this country for 100 years, hung at the height of a person who wanted to sit and look at the yard and not have to think about anything requiring. Douglas had built a porch swing. She got out of the car. Silas was already out of his standing a respectful distance back, which was the behavior of a man who understood that this arrival belonged to her and not to him. She walked to the porch. The steps were solid. She noted this without intending to the specific solidity of well-built steps, each one level, no flex, the work of someone who had built things that held. She put her hand on the porch railing, also solid. Douglas had built bridges. He had applied the same attention to a porch railing. She sat in the swing. She pushed off once gently. It moved the way it was supposed to move, even smoothed the chains, doing what chains did when they had been hung correctly. She sat in Douglas's swing in front of Douglas's house in Millbrook, 400 miles from the house she had been put out of, and she looked at the yard. The garden beds along the front of the house were overgrown. She could see the shapes of what they had been meant to be, the perennial plantings that Douglas had started and that had continued on their own, without anyone to tend them, gone a little wild, in the way of things that had been established and then left. She recognized some of what was in them, coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, the late-season stalks of something that would be back in the spring. She thought he planted things that would come back. He had planted perennials. He had been planning for springs he would not necessarily see. Silas climbed the steps and stopped at the edge of the porch. He said he furnished it over the last several years. Nothing elaborate. He said you weren't a person who needed elaborate. She said no. He said you were a person who needed solid, his word. She said that sounds like him. She stood from the swing. She tried the front door. She went inside. The room she entered was the main room, kitchen, and sitting area together, open with the fireplace at the far end and the windows she had seen from outside, now showing the yard and the trees. The light was doing what it did at this hour of an October afternoon, coming in low and warm, the specific October light she had been driving through all day, finding the wood floor and the stone hearth and the simple furniture that Douglas had chosen or made. The table was small. 4 chairs, though she thought Douglas had not imagined 4 people, had imagined 2, and added the extra chairs with the specific practical optimism of someone who built things to last past the immediate situation. On the table was an envelope. Her name on the front. His handwriting! She sat down at the table. She picked up the envelope. She held it for a moment. She had been holding herself together for a month through the hospital corridor and the kitchen table at dawn and the garage and the 400 miles with the specific controlled containment of a woman who had been a librarian for 31 years and understood that things needed to be kept in order, that losing the order was losing the ability to function, and she had needed to function. She opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten in the careful, deliberate script of a man who did not write letters often and had taken the time this one required. She read, "Marlene, if you're reading this, I'm gone. That's the situation I was trying to prepare for, so I won't pretend I didn't know it might come. I want to explain some things. I want to start with the thing I should have said more clearly while I was alive, which is that I have loved you since the first month we were married. And I have not been good at saying that, and I am sorry for that. You have known me long enough to know that the way I say things is usually not with words. I hope you have also known me long enough to understand that the absence of the words did not mean the absence of the thing. This house is the thing. I bought the land 25 years ago. I had been watching Chester for longer than that, watching how he thought about the family property, watching how he talked about things that should belong to the family, and I understood what that meant for you if something happened to me. You would have no claim he considered legitimate. You would be in his accounting a wife, meaning a temporary condition, meaning someone who could be managed out of the situation. I could not fix that with a will. Chester would contest a will. Chester would find the lawyers and the arguments and the time to contest a will, and you would spend years fighting something that should not require fighting, and I did not want that for you. What I could do was buy land with my own money in your name, only in a county where Chester has no relationships and no leverage, and build something on it that is yours before I am gone. A completed fact, not a bequest that can be contested. A property that has been recorded in your name for 11 years and cannot be reached by anything Chester thinks he owns. This house is not an inheritance. It is yours. It has been yours for 11 years. She stopped reading. She looked up at the room, at the fireplace, the windows, the October light on the wood floor. She looked at the walls which Douglas had built, and the ceiling which Douglas had built, and the door through which she had come, which Douglas had built and hung on hinges he had chosen with the same attention he brought to everything he considered worth building. She thought about the load-bearing wall. She thought about 35 years of him showing up. She thought this is how he said things. This was how Douglas Ashworth said "I love you" with 40 acres and a foundation, and 25 years of weekends and a porch swing hung at exactly the right height, and perennial flowers planted to come back in springs he did not know if he would see. She put her hand flat on the table. She did not try to hold herself together. She let go. Not loudly, quietly, the way she did most things, the tears arriving without announcement, without the heaving grief of the past month, but with something quieter and more complete, the specific release of a person who has been given something they did not know they needed and has finally understood what it is. Outside the window, the oaks were doing what oaks did in October. Silas was on the porch. The swing was moving slightly in the wind. She sat at Douglas's table in Douglas's house, and she read the rest of his letter, and the afternoon light came through the windows he had placed for exactly this, for the light for the hour, for the person sitting here when he could not be. The letter was 3 pages. She read it slowly, not because the handwriting was difficult, though his script had changed over the years, had gotten more deliberate as he aged, the letters more carefully formed, as if he had understood that he was writing fewer things, and each one deserved more attention. She read slowly because some things required the time they required, and this was one of them. He had begun in 1998. That was the year their furnace had failed in January, and Chester had appeared at the door 2 days later with an offer to cover the repair costs, an offer that Douglas had declined quietly, without explaining why to Marlene. She had thought at the time that he was being proud. She understood now that he had understood something she had not, that Chester's generosity had terms, and the terms were a kind of ownership, and Douglas was not interested in giving Chester anything he could call a claim. He wrote, "I have been watching Chester since before we were married. I knew what he was when we were boys. My father knew what he was, and left the property in a trust that Chester could access, because my father believed that family meant something, regardless of character. I did not have the same belief, but I could not change the trust. What I could do was make sure you had something outside of it. He wrote, "I am not a demonstrative man. You have known this about me for 35 years, and you have been patient with it in a way I have not always deserved. The truth is that I have spent our marriage trying to find ways to show you what I couldn't always say. The furnace, the roof in 2003, the car I bought you the year you retired, the one you said was too nice for a librarian. These were me saying something. I hope you understood that." Marlene looked up from the letter. The car. She had thought he had been extravagant about the car, had teased him about it, had said it was too much, had noticed he seemed pleased when she drove it. She had catalogued it under his occasional surprising gestures and moved on. She had not understood, or she had understood partially in the way, you understood things that were shown, rather than said you received them, you appreciated them, but without the translation, you could not fully read the language. She was reading it now. She went back to the letter. He had bought the land for $11,000 in 1998 from a farmer who was selling parcels to cover estate costs. He had found it through a colleague who did occasional work in the northern counties, a man who knew Douglas needed something quiet and in another jurisdiction and had made a call. He wrote, "I paid cash. I kept no record of the transaction in our shared accounts. I opened a separate account at a bank in this county. You will find the details with Silas, and I have been maintaining it from my personal consulting income." Chester has never had access to my consulting income. It went there. She thought about the consulting trips. She had thought they were consulting trips. They had been consulting trips. He had done the work, billed the hours, maintained the professional relationships that generated the income. But the income had been going somewhere she hadn't known about, into an account that had been quietly accumulating for 25 years. He wrote, "The house took longer than I expected. I am a structural engineer, not a carpenter, and I had to learn things as I went. The first summer I got the foundation wrong and had to start over. I don't tell you this because it matters now, but because I want you to know that it was not easy, and I did it anyway. Some things you do not stop doing because they are not easy." Marlene pressed her hand flat on the table. She thought about Douglas in 1998, 50 years old, driving north, getting a foundation wrong and starting over, coming back the next month and the month after that. 25 years of coming back. She finished the second page. The third page was shorter. He wrote, "I did not tell you because I was afraid Chester would find out. He has connections in county records offices, or at least he thinks he does, and I did not trust that a property in your name would stay invisible if you knew about it, because you would have wanted to tell people the way you tell people things that make you happy, and I could not risk that." He wrote, "I also did not tell you because I wanted it to be finished. I am an engineer. I do not like to show someone a bridge that is not done. I wanted to bring you here in the spring when the light was right and the garden had come back and the porch swing was ready, and I wanted to walk you through the door of a completed thing and say, 'This is yours, I built it for you, no one can take it.'" He wrote, "I did not get to do that." He wrote, "But you are there, which means you found the box and you drove north, which means you are exactly who I have known you to be for 35 years. I am glad you are there. I am glad the house is there. I am glad Silas is there." He wrote, "There is a trust. Silas will explain it. It is enough for you to live without worrying. That was the other thing I could do, make sure that not worrying was available to you." He wrote, "I love you. I should have said it more. I said it the way I knew how." He wrote, "Come home." She sat with the letter. The afternoon had moved. While she was reading, the light through the windows was lower now, the specific late afternoon light that was different from the light she had arrived in, and the room had changed in the way rooms changed when the light changed the same objects differently visible. Silas came in from the porch. He had been outside for the entire reading, which was the behavior of a man who had been holding this secret for 23 years and understood that the moment of its release belonged to her and not to him. He sat in the chair across from her. He said he wrote that letter 2 years ago when he was diagnosed. The first diagnosis, not serious, but a warning. He wanted to have it ready. She said he knew he might not be there for the spring. Silas said he hoped he would be, but he prepared for the other possibility. That was Douglas. She folded the letter. She put it back in the envelope. She set it on the table between them. She said, "The trust." Silas said he established it 8 years ago. It holds the property and a cash account. The account has been funded gradually from his consulting income he added to it every year. It's not a large sum by some standards, but it's enough. More than enough if you're careful, which I understand you are. She said, How long was he planning this? Silas said, The land was the beginning. The trust came after when he had the property established and wanted to formalize the protection. He said, I want to make sure that if something happens before I can explain it to her, she has everything she needs to understand what this is and why it's hers. He said he thought of most things. She said he didn't think of the truck. Silas said no, he didn't think of the truck. They sat with that for a moment, the specific weight of the thing Douglas had not been able to plan around the thing that had happened anyway. She said Chester. Silas said Chester has no claim here. The property has been in your name for 11 years, recorded in this county unencumbered. It was not purchased with joint funds. It was not part of any family trust. It is a separate asset that Douglas acquired with his own income and placed in your name as a completed gift. Chester can consult every attorney in the state. There is nothing to contest. He said Douglas was very careful about that. He asked me several times over the years to confirm that the structure was sound, that nothing had changed in the law that would create vulnerability. He was thorough. She said he was an engineer. Silas said he was an engineer. She looked at the window. The oaks outside were doing what oaks did in the late afternoon of an October day, holding their remaining leaves with the specific tenacity of trees that had been through many Octobers and knew they would be through many more. Douglas had planted perennials in the garden beds. He had hung a porch swing. He had built a fireplace out of stone because he had known she liked fireplaces, because she had mentioned it once. Probably she could not pinpoint the occasion, and he had remembered, and he had built one. She thought 35 years. She thought all those roads. She thought he came here every few weeks for 25 years and built me a house and never said a word. And the reason he never said a word was that he loved me and was afraid that saying a word would take it away. She said he should have told me. Silas said yes. She said I would have wanted to know. Silas said yes. She said, but I understand why he didn't. Silas said I know. She said he was protecting the house. Silas said he was protecting you. She sat in the chair at Douglas's table in Douglas's house. Her table, her house. And she looked at the letter in its envelope, and she thought about a man who had built bridges for 40 years and had spent the last 25 of them building this, the specific unglamorous patient work of a man who showed love by making sure the structure held. Come home, he had written. She was home. The county clerk's office was on the ground floor of the courthouse, which was the building at the center of Millbrook that had been doing the county's serious business since 1887, according to the date carved above the entrance. Inside the building had the specific quality of institutions that had been continuously occupied for over a century, the accumulated gravity of all the recorded transactions, the births and deaths and property transfers and legal proceedings that had passed through these offices and been filed and kept. Agnes Poole had been the county's register of deeds for 19 years. She was 62, with the specific, competent calm of a woman who had spent 2 decades managing the documentary record of a county's property and had developed through that work an intimate familiarity with the legal landscape of every parcel within the county lines. She knew which properties had complicated histories. She knew which deeds had been contested and which had not, and why. She knew the difference between a clean recording and a problematic one at a glance. She had known about the Ashworth parcel for 11 years. "Mom," Silas had called ahead. When Marlene and Silas came through the door of the clerk's office, Agnes was already at the counter with the file. She had pulled it before they arrived, which was the behavior of a woman who had been told what was coming and had prepared accordingly. She looked at Marlene. She said, "Mrs. Ashworth, I'm glad you came." Marlene said, "You know who I am." Agnes said Douglas came in here himself when the deed was first recorded 11 years ago. He wanted to make sure the recording was clean. He came back twice after that just to verify. He told me she paused selecting the right words. He told me that someday his wife would probably come in and want to confirm the status of the property. He said she was a librarian and would want to see the primary source. Marlene said, "That sounds like him." Agnes opened the file. The deed was on heavy paper, the kind that county recorders used for official documents, with the county seal embossed at the top, and the recording stamp in the margin received and recorded the date 11 years ago, the book and page number that located it in the permanent record of this county. Agnes laid it flat on the counter. She said, "Parcel number 4471-B, 40 acres in the northwest quarter of Section 14, Township 6 North. The deed was recorded on October 14th, 11 years ago. The grantor was the estate of Harold Fenwick, the farmer Douglas purchased from. The grantee's sole and exclusive is Marlene Ruth Ashworth." She ran her finger down the document. She said there are no liens on this property, no mortgages, no encumbrances of any kind. There have been no claims filed against it, no lease pendens, no notices of any legal proceedings. In 11 years, this parcel has been exactly what it appears to be, a piece of property owned outright, free and clear by one person. She looked up. "She said you." Marlene looked at the deed. She looked at her name on the document, her full name, Marlene Ruth Ashworth, in the typed font of a legal instrument, and she thought about Douglas standing at this counter 11 years ago, confirming the recording, asking about the status of the file. She thought about him coming back twice more just to check. A structural engineer verifying load capacity, making sure the thing he had built would hold. It had held. 11 years untouched, exactly what it was. Silas said, "For the record, and I want this stated clearly in front of a witness, can you confirm that this property has no connection to the Ashworth Family Trust or to any jointly held Ashworth family asset?" Agnes said correct. This deed was a private transaction between Douglas Ashworth, acting as an individual buyer with personal funds, and the Fenwick estate. It predates any commingling with marital assets under the legal definitions applicable in this state. It is not subject to any family trust instrument, any joint tenancy arrangement, or any estate proceeding related to Douglas Ashworth's death. She said if someone were to challenge this deed, they would need to demonstrate either that the purchase funds were improperly sourced, which would require tracing 25-year-old bank records from a separate county, or that the recording itself was defective, which it is not. She closed the file. She said there is no viable legal challenge to this deed. That's my assessment after 19 years in this office. Silas said, "That's also my assessment after 50 years of practice." Agnes stamped the file copy. She had prepared a certified copy of the deed for Marlene to take and set it on the counter. Marlene picked it up. She held it in both hands. She thought about the metal box under the floorboard, the receipts in order by date, Douglas organizing his evidence the way she organized the library's collection by a system that made sense to him, that would make sense to whoever came looking for it. He had known someone would come looking. He had organized it for her. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Chester. She had known this call was coming, had known it since she left probably, or since the garage, or since the night she had sat at the kitchen table watching the sun come up, and understood that whatever came next was going to require more from her than she currently had. She had been gathering what she needed. The receipts, the road, the gas station, Silas, the house, the letter, the deed in her hands. She had what she needed now, she answered. Chester said, "Where are you?" Darlene said, "Your car is gone. You don't get to just disappear." Marlene, we had an arrangement. She said, "Chester." He stopped. She had never interrupted him before. In 35 years of knowing Chester Ashworth, she had absorbed his sentences, waited for them to end, and responded after. She had not interrupted. She interrupted now because she was 69 years old, and she was standing in the county clerk's office in Millbrook with a certified deed in her hand, and she was finished waiting. She said, "I'm at my house." He said, "What house? You have 30 days. She said, "Not that house. My house. The one Douglas built for me." A pause. She said, "Douglas spent 25 years building me a house in Millbrook. He bought the land with his own money. He built it himself. He put it in my name 11 years ago and recorded the deed in this county. It has no connection to the family trust or to any asset you have a claim on. She said, I'm standing in the county clerk's office right now. The clerk has confirmed that the deed is clean, unencumbered, and not subject to challenge. She said Silas Cormack is Douglas's attorney of record for this property. He has 23 years of documentation of everything Douglas did here. She said you can consult anyone you want. You can make any calls you want. You can hire anyone you want. She said the deed is in my name. It has been in my name for 11 years. Douglas made sure of that. Chester said, what are you? She said, I'm home Chester. Douglas built me a home. You cannot reach it. She said, I think that was his point. A long pause. Then, you think this is over? She said, I think Douglas finished what he was building. Yes. She ended the call. She stood at the counter with the phone in one hand and the certified deed in the other. Agnes was looking at her with the expression of a woman who has been in a clerk's office for 19 years and has witnessed the resolution of many property disputes and has developed opinions about which resolutions were just. She said, well done. Silas beside her said nothing. He was smiling in the way of a man who had been carrying a secret for 23 years and had just watched it do what it was made to do. Marlene looked at the deed. She looked at her name on it. She thought about Douglas at this counter 11 years ago, confirming the recording, making sure it was clean. She thought about him driving 400 miles month after month, building something with his hands. She thought about the letter. Come home. She folded the certified copy carefully the way she had always folded documents that mattered, the library habit, the habit of respecting the thing you were handling, and she put it in her coat pocket. She said, thank you. She said it to Agnes and to Silas and to the county clerk's office and to Douglas, who was not there and had been everywhere today, in every mile of the drive, and every word of the letter and the solid steps of the porch and the swing hung at exactly the right height. She walked out of the courthouse into the October afternoon. The air was cold and specific. The drive back to the house was 3 miles. She knew the way now. She moved in on a Saturday. There was not much to move. Chester had made sure of that in the specific, thorough way of someone who understood that possession was its own argument and had acted accordingly. What she had was what she had taken from the garage, the metal box, the road atlas, Douglas's tools from the pegboard, a box of books she had managed to carry out before the lock went on the door, and the clothes she had been wearing for the past week. She carried these things from the car to the house in 3 trips. On the last trip, she stood on the porch with the empty car behind her and the house before her, and she thought, this is what starting looks like. Not dramatic, just the ordinary work of beginning. She went inside. The first week was practical. She had been a librarian for 31 years, which meant she had spent her professional life imposing order on accumulated material, and she brought the same sensibility to the house. She cataloged what was there. The furniture Douglas had chosen, the kitchen supplies he had stocked, the tools, in the small shed at the back. She made lists, she identified what was needed and what was not, and she drove into Millbrook and bought the needed things at the hardware store, whose proprietor turned out to know Douglas's name, and expressed condolences with the genuine warmth of someone who had interacted with a person regularly and had valued the interaction. This kept happening. The woman at the diner where Douglas had eaten breakfast on Saturday mornings. The man at the lumber yard who had helped him load materials more times than he could count. The librarian at the Millbrook Public Library, a small woman in her 50s who said when Marlene introduced herself, "We've been expecting you in a way." Douglas talked about you. They had all been expecting her. Douglas had been building her a community as well as a house. Not deliberately, she did not think it had been a plan. But a man who drove 400 miles every few weeks for 25 years, who ate at the same diner and bought his lumber from the same yard and stopped at the same gas station had become known. And in being known, he had made her known. She had existed in Millbrook as a presence before she had ever set foot there, as the wife, the librarian, the person this was all for. She found this strange and moving. She found most things that month strange and moving. She fixed the garden in the 2nd week. The perennials had survived without attention. That was the point of perennials Douglas had understood. This had chosen them specifically because they came back without requiring anything. but they had grown in the unruly way of things left to themselves, spreading beyond their beds, tangling with each other, developing the enthusiastic disorder of plants that had been given good soil and left to decide their own arrangements. She spent 3 days in the garden. Her knees were not what they had been, which meant kneeling pads and a low stool and the specific patience of a woman who had learned to work within her physical limitations without resentment. She cut back the overgrowth, redefined the bed edges, divided the clumps that had gotten too large. She found at the back of the largest bed a rose she had not noticed planted against the house's foundation, sheltered from the worst of the weather, still showing the last few leaves of the season. She did not know what color it was. She would find out in the spring. Chester did not call again. She had half expected him to had expected the next volley the threat of legal action, the specific persistence of a man who had made a plan and did not accept that the plan had failed. But nothing came. Not a call, not a letter, not a message through Silas. Silas, when she mentioned it, said he consulted an attorney. The attorney told him what I would have told him. There's nothing to contest. She said, so that's it. Silas said, that's it. She thought about the specific anticlimax of it, the absence of a confrontation that she had been bracing for. All of Chester's certainty, all of his preparation, all of the locked doors and the 30-day deadline and the specific cruelty of arriving the day after the funeral, and in the end what had stopped him was a deed recorded 11 years ago in a county he had never thought to look in by a man who had understood him completely and had worked quietly and patiently around him for 25 years. Douglas had not needed a confrontation. He had needed a deed. She hung the wedding photograph in the main room. It was the only photograph she had with her. She had taken it from the nightstand before the lock went on because it was the photograph she slept beside, and she had known even in the shock of that first week that she would need it. She found a nail already in the wall at the height a person would put a photograph, and she understood that Douglas had put it there. He had known she would want a photograph on that wall. She hung it. She stepped back and looked at it, the two of them 35 years ago, in the specific, slightly formal happiness of people who had arrived at a thing they had wanted and were not yet used to having it. She said, I found it, Douglas. I found the house. She said, I found you. Not the Douglas she had been living beside for 35 years, though she had loved that Douglas and would continue to. The other one. The one who had driven 400 miles every few weeks for 25 years and built her a place to stand. The one who had organized the receipts by date so she could follow them. The one who had left the letter on the table because he knew she would sit at a table to read. She had spent 35 years married to a man she felt she did not entirely know. She knew him now. She started volunteering at the library in November. The Millbrook Public Library was small, one room essentially, with a children's corner and a periodicals section, and a circulation desk that one person could manage, and it was understaffed in the way of small-town institutions that ran on commitment rather than budget. The librarian was glad for the help. She read to children on Tuesday afternoons. She chose the books she had loved when she worked the ones about animals and journeys and small people doing large things, and she sat in the children's corner and read to whoever came, which was sometimes 3 children and sometimes 8 and once in December 11. One afternoon, a boy of about 7 asked her where she had come from. She said, I drove here from far away. He said, why? She said, my husband built me a house here. He built it over a long time, a little at a time, and when I found it, I decided to stay. The boy considered this. He said, did you know he was building it? She said, no. It was a surprise. The boy said, that's a good surprise. She said, yes. It was the best one I ever got. The letter arrived on a morning in December, forwarded through Silas's office. A woman from a town 2 counties over, she gave her name, explained her situation in the careful, slightly formal prose of someone writing to a stranger about something difficult. Her husband had died in the spring. His family had moved quickly. She had found herself with very little in a house that was no longer hers. She had heard through connections she did not specify about a woman named Marlene who had found something that helped her. She wrote, I don't know if you can help me. I don't know what I'm looking for. I just know that I am in the position you were in, and I heard that you got through it, and I wondered if you would be willing to talk. Marlene read the letter at the kitchen table. She set it down. She looked out the window at the yard, at the garden beds, which were dormant now, but had been tended at the porch, where the swing moved slightly in the December wind, at the oaks that Douglas had not planted but had chosen, had driven 400 miles to stand among. She thought about Agnes Poole saying, "Well done." She thought about Silas saying he was protecting you. She thought about a boy of 7 saying that's a good surprise. She thought about Douglas at the gas station at mile 207 ordering the same thing every time, building a relationship over years without announcing that he was doing it, leaving evidence that could be followed by someone who knew how to read it. He had been a structural engineer. He had known how to build things that held. She picked up her pen. She began to write back.